It's a real pleasure to give this opening lecture for this one-day autumn school. My task this morning is to give you a sort of a broad sense of what post-Keynesian economics is. And for me, that means showing you what its differences are with what I will call mainstream economics and why those differences are important. This lecture is a sort of an abbreviated 1-hour version of what is a 3-hour or even a 4-hour lecture. So it's going to be a speed of light sort of tour of post-Keynesian economics. I think it's a little bit, we're in Europe here, it's a bit like, you know, the American tourist who comes to Europe and does 7 capitals in 7 days. Of course, they haven't a clue why these countries exist, why their boundaries are one way, why one type of buildings come before another, and they leave totally confused. But I know that all of you have some familiarity with post-Keynesian economics, and so hopefully this tour of light lecture speed of light lecture can give you a sort of a sense of the overall architecture. Now, in the standard introductory lecture to post-Keynesian economics, you tend to get something like people will give you a list of features, a list of characteristics, a taxonomy of post-Keynesian economics. And there's some very good examples of that. I know that Mark Lavoie's new book on post-Keynesian economics, its opening chapter is very comprehensive and very good. I would recommend that. And John King has just written a new book, a short little book called An Advanced Introduction to Post-Keynesian Economics that takes that taxonomy approach to things. I'm not going to go that route, in part because it's been done before and I can't do it any better. And in part also I want to try something different, what I call a history of thought approach, because a history of thought approach is a bit more organic, a little less dry. Will let you connect the dots as well as seeing what the collection of dots are. And I hope that this will kind of complement. My goal is still the same. At the end of the day, I will hope you understand post-Keynesian economics, but I hope you'll have a sort of a slightly different perspective on it. Now, the starting point is we need some sort of definition of post-Keynesian economics. Let's see if this works. Yes, it did. Great. And so this is my own definition, and there are 4 features to this. Feature number 1 is that post-Keynesians believe in fundamental uncertainty. This is very, very central. It's sort of like the foundation stone. Feature number 2 is that they believe in Keynes's theory of effective demand-determined output. Feature number 3 is that they believe the failure of the economy to adjust to full employment is not due to price and wage rigidities, though those may have adverse effects too. Let's not rule it out. It's just that the fundamental cause of unemployment is not price and wage rigidities. And then feature number 4, that the real wage is not equal to the marginal utility of labor except in the limiting circumstance of full employment. Well, that's basically saying that you're not on the labor supply schedule. That's a neoclassical way of saying you're not on the labor supply schedule. I want to emphasize 2 points here, though, about this. That the fundamental uncertainty point, why is it so important? Well, fundamental uncertainty explains why it's impossible to contract one's way out of the Keynesian condition. Fundamental uncertainty explains why what is the Arrow-Debreu perspective in mainstream economics must be ontologically wrong. That model just cannot be in the real world because it does not recognize fundamental uncertainty. You cannot contract your way to full employment in a capitalist economy. Point number 2, Keynes's principle of effective demand, is that this is a general theory of output determination in a capitalist economy. It's not a theory of depression economics. It's not a special case. Paul Krugman is one who sort of says that we're in depression economics, and somehow, were we to get past the zero lower bound, we'd be in full employment economics. Capitalism is not dichotomous like that, and that's what Keynes was getting at. Now, on the other hand, the response, the output response of an economy to an increase in aggregate demand can vary. The further you are away from this full employment notional position, an increase in aggregate demand will tend to generate more output response and less price response. The closer, of course, you get to full employment, then an increase in aggregate demand will tend to generate a lesser proportion of output response and a more of a price response. Okay. Now, Figure 1 provides my stylized representation of the history of economic thought. And in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk my way through this figure, and then after that, I'm going to explore how the issues raised in this figure affect post-Keynesian economics. And that's why you see these drop-down boxes for Figure 4. That's where we'll take the history of thought and wrap it into post-Keynesian economics today. Yeah, let me try that. I'm not so tall. This was up for Sebastian. He's German. I'm English. The origins of modern thought are sort of identified with the mercantilists, the political arithmetic of William Petty, and the tableau physique, the physiocrats, and Keynes. Petty was a 17th century English political economist who produced the first set of national income accounts, and national income accounting is critical to Keynesian economics, both for operationalizing it and for theorizing it. Keynes was a member of the 18th century French physiocratic school, and his tableau économique is viewed as the beginning of input-output analysis. And the mercantilists tackle the very complicated question of the relationship between the balance of trade, domestic economic activity, and the international economy. I'll just make a little footnote here. It's Keynes notes in the general theory in chapter 24 that mercantilism is very misunderstood, and it has an undeserved bad reputation in mainstream economics. And in a way, Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics both seek to recover certain aspects of mercantilist thought and logic. They don't recover it in its entirety, but there are some core ideas within it that have been too easily dismissed as a result of sort of Ricardo's free trade economics that the mercantilists have a bad, undeserved bad name. Now, the first point that I want to get across in this figure is that it shows that very early on there was a fundamental split that developed within economic theory between what can be called the German historical school and what I've labeled the Anglo-Saxon school. This split was actually articulated in the great Methodenstreit, the method dispute, the controversy that erupted amongst German economists in the 1880s. And of course, we all know that the Anglo-Saxon school has come to dominate modern economics, and the ideas of the German school have been pushed to the fringe. And again, this is very evident if you look at the names up there. We're all familiar with the names of Smith, Locke, and Hume, but the names of Hildebrand and von Schmoller, the founders of the German school, probably most of you may not have heard of them at all. And I suppose most people, if you go to MIT or Stanford or Harvard, they certainly haven't heard of these people. But, and here's the kicker, the ideas that these people are talking about, Hildebrand, Schmoller, Marx, List, and down that list, these ideas constantly resurface to trouble mainstream economics. And mainstream economics has a problem grappling with them, and that's one of the themes I'm going to be exploring this morning. The second essential feature of this figure 1 concerns the place of Keynes and his relationship to the Anglo-Saxon school. Keynes comes out of the Anglo-Saxon school. He's trained at Cambridge by Marshall, and he's very much sort of part of the Anglo-Saxon establishment thinking. But he is a malcontent within the Anglo-Saxon school. The main line of reasoning runs through Ricardo, starts with Smith, Locke, and Hume, then on to Ricardo, Then the marginalists, Valras-Lausanne school, it's formulated as neoclassical general equilibrium economics with Hicks and de Brue, and then there's classical macroeconomics. The malcontent line runs through Malthus and the underconsumptionists onto Keynes. And so viewed in this light, what Keynes is trying to do is he's breaking a little bit with neoclassical economics by reintroducing the ideas of Malthus and the underconsumptionists, which got pushed out of mainstream economics by Ricardo. So let's now turn to talk about the Anglo-Saxon School in a bit more depth. This is obviously an edited version of Figure 1, and I think it has a certain shock value. When you just wipe out that left-hand side of the figure, you get to see just how much is missing in mainstream economics. And this should be motivation enough to be interested in post-Keynesian economics, because post-Keynesian economics is trying to bring those ideas back in to the center of discussion. Now, Adam Smith, of course, is widely viewed as the founder of the Anglo-Saxon School, and his importance is captured in the Wealth of Nations, the idea of the invisible hand, the metaphor of the invisible hand, which, of course, has become in 20th century general equilibrium theory, the invisible hand is a metaphor for the price system. The pursuit of self-interest works to the benefit of all, guided by the price system. And of course, that is the fundamental theorem, the first theorem of the first welfare theorem of general equilibrium economics. So, in a manner of speaking, Smith is viewed as the founding father of neoclassical microeconomics. A second seminal contribution then comes from John Locke and David Hume, who can be viewed as the founding fathers of monetary macroeconomics. However, what's important is whereas Smith's microeconomic ideas are largely consistent with post-Keynesian economics, Locke and Hume's monetary macroeconomics are fundamentally inconsistent. Locke and Hume were engaged in the mercantilist controversy, and their ideas triumphed. According to them, increases in the money supply resulting from an inflow of bullion caused by trade surpluses only generated an increase in prices. So, in effect, Locke and Hume were the progenitors of classical monetarism and the quantity theory of money, which have significantly shaped the history of monetary macroeconomics along fundamentally un-Keynesian lines. And so sadly to say, one could say that from its inception, monetary macroeconomics got off to a bad start that it has never really recovered from. And part of the Keynesian and post-Keynesian project is to give a better foundation to monetary macroeconomics. Now, the next critical stage in the development of the Anglo-Saxon School, I should put my... I know I'm going to lose track of time very easily here. What time am I supposed to finish at? I've had 15 minutes. We didn't begin at 9 o'clock. We began at 9:30. Great, okay. I'm a bit of shock there. You'll learn one day when you get up here, this is a time warp here. When you're giving a lecture, it's very hard to get a sense of how much time you're taking. The next critical stage is the conflict between Malthus and Ricardo regarding the question of full employment. Malthus challenged Say's law and believed in the possibility of gluts. Ricardo assumed full employment, at least in the industrial sector, and he assumed that to be the normal condition, and that then became the standard condition of standard assumption of classical economics. And actually, Keynes believed this to be the decisive mistake in Anglo-Saxon economics. There's a lovely passage, I think it's in chapter 3 somewhere, maybe chapter 4, where Keynes talks about Ricardo conquering England as thoroughly as the Inquisition conquered Spain. After Ricardo, the story enters really quite familiar terrain for all of you, I'm sure. You get the neoclassical revolution in economics based on the application of the principle of marginalism, and you get the development of the general equilibrium school of economics with Walras in Lausanne. Marginalism was applied to individual choice by the likes of Jevons, Mill, Edgeworth, Menger, and it was applied to production theory by J.B. Clark to generate marginal productivity theory. However, because of the triumph of Ricardo's thinking about full employment became the default normal assumption in all of this economic analysis. So these pieces, marginal utility theory, marginal productivity theory, the price system, general equilibrium analysis, and Pareto's welfare economics, were then gradually elaborated and combined to form neoclassical competitive general equilibrium theory. Hicks, his Value and Capital, published in 1939, a very important book in the history of thought. And then, of course, Arrow and DeBrue's proof of the existence of a general equilibrium in 1954. And that today is the analytical core of contemporary economics. It's the benchmark. When they do economics afterwards, they take this benchmark and they maybe vary something and do some variation around it, add some imperfection, and then see what the implications of it are. But this is the benchmark for neoclassical theory. And what's rather ironic about this story is that the completion of neoclassical microeconomics, it's a double irony. The completion of neoclassical microeconomics was happening at exactly the same time that Keynes was writing his general theory and launching the Keynesian revolution in economics. And here I'm thinking of that the general theory is published in 1936, Hicks's Value and Capital is published in 1939. The two processes are going on simultaneously. And the double irony is that Hicks was a major contributor to both. In 1937, his article on the general theory introduced the Keynesian ISLM framework, while it was his 1939 book, Value and Capital, which laid out the foundations of what is core modern neoclassical economics. To continue with the story, one last little piece here. Classical macro is then the macroeconomic outgrowth of neoclassical microeconomics, or let us call it the complement of neoclassical microeconomics. It's the last block in our survey, and it was developed in tandem and sort of at the hip with neoclassical microeconomics. And it's the two together, neoclassical microeconomics, general equilibrium theory, plus classical macroeconomics, that form the Anglo-Saxon canon. Now, classical macroeconomics adds two features to the neoclassical microeconomic story. First, it incorporates money into the analysis. Remember, money is not present in Arrow-DeBrue theory. And it incorporates money using Locke and Hume's quantity theory analysis, according to which the role of money is simply to determine the price level. Money is neutral with respect to economic activity, and there is a dichotomy between real and nominal variables. The second feature of classical macro is it adds what we call the loanable funds market to determine the real interest rate. So the loanable funds real equilibrium real interest rate equilibrates saving and investment, thereby equilibrating the demand and supply of goods. So according to classical macroeconomics, the loanable funds market real interest rate is the mechanism that clears the goods market and ensures that Say's law holds. If there's an increase in supply of goods, additional demand for those goods is created by lowering the loanable funds market real interest rate. So we've now completed our speed of light tour of Anglo-Saxon economics. And now, so you may be wondering, this is supposed to be a lecture about post-Keynesian economics, so why have I spent so much time, first 15, 20 minutes of this lecture, on the Anglo-Saxon School? And the reason is that both Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics represent a fundamental critique of the canon, so that you can really only understand Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics by reference to the canon. You need to understand these arguments to understand why Keynes and the post-Keynesians are making other arguments. So let's now turn and discuss how Keynes broke with the neoclassicals. In my view, Keynes's general theory can be viewed as the beginning of the process of walking away from neoclassical microeconomics and walking away from the classical macroeconomic canon. And what post-Keynesians are doing are continuing that process of walking away. In particular, Keynes broke decisively with classical macroeconomics. However, his break with neoclassical microeconomics was much more limited and much more ambiguous. So an important implication of this is that it is possible to be Keynesian with neoclassical foundations, neoclassical microeconomic foundations, and of course it's also possible to be Keynesian with non-neoclassical microeconomic foundations, or some combination of the two. And that possibility has been and continues to be a source of contention in post-Keynesian economics. Some post-Keynesians want a complete and comprehensive break from all aspects of neoclassical microeconomics. Others want to retain pieces of it. I put myself more in that place. There are pieces of neoclassical microeconomics I'm comfortable with and pieces that I want to be rid of. The second feature, the main feature about Keynes here is that he revived Malthus's claim that economics could be, economies could be subject to persistent supply gluts, contrary to Say's law. The Anglo-Saxon neoclassical economics, the Anglo-Saxon school, pushed the supply glut folks to what Keynes called the underworld of economics. The underconsumptionists, Hobson, Mummery, they existed. They were not part of mainstream academy of the late 19th century and early 20th century. They were the outsiders. And Keynes sought to bring them back to legitimize their line of thinking. And he did this. I mean, they had a series of stories about why you could have supply gluts. Keynes legitimized that underworld, giving its ideas logical coherence and formalizing those ideas in his theory of effective demand. Now, the first critical innovation was Keynes's notion of fundamental uncertainty that he introduces in chapter 12 of the general theory. That's the chapter on the state of long-term expectation. As I said before, fundamental uncertainty is absolutely critical because it explains the existence of money, and it explains why agents cannot contract their way to full employment. If you don't have fundamental uncertainty, you have no reason for having money. Money will always be dominated by other forms of contracting and by bonds in particular. The second critical break concerns Keynes's rejection of loanable funds theory, which he replaces with liquidity preference theory of interest rates. And two consequences follow from the replacement of loanable funds theory by liquidity preference theory. First, the rejection of loanable funds theory means the economy has no mechanism for equilibrating full employment saving and full employment investment. That is the classical mechanism to make Say's law hold to ensure full employment. Take it away, the economy can't do the job. It lacks the mechanism. So the rejection of loanable funds theory is the way in which Keynes disproved Say's law and rehabilitated Malthus's theory of gluts. Second, the introduction of liquidity preference theory in place of loanable funds theory means that the interest rate becomes a monetary phenomena, and it breaks the classical notion of dichotomy between nominal and real variables. Now, whereas Keynes broke absolutely and conclusively with classical macroeconomics, his relationship with neoclassical micro is more ambiguous. And I say that's a cause of disagreement amongst post-Keynesians. With regard to utility theory, capital theory, marginal productivity theory, and equilibrium, Keynes remains substantially within the paradigm, though there are differences. People will read Keynes and see different things and try and read between the lines. But for me, it's a reasonable point of view to say that he was within paradigm on these issues. There's one aspect of neoclassical microeconomics that Keynes breaks with decisively and unambiguously, and that is the market clearing capacity of the price system. Whereas Keynes accepted the Marshallian single market partial equilibrium price mechanism, he rejected claims that prices and nominal wages could adjust to equilibrate the labor market and the overall economy. And this rejection is absolutely crystal clear in chapter 19 on changes in money wages. So, in sum, we can collect out where we're at now. Keynes breaks decisively with classical macroeconomics. His relationship to neoclassical micro is more ambiguous. The one issue in neoclassical micro that he breaks with decisively is the issue of the price system's ability to ensure full employment. And he does and how does that connect to post-Keynesians? Post-Keynesians fully accept Keynes's break with classical macro, but and what they've been doing, I think, is seeking to elaborate and further strengthen the arguments behind that break with classical macro. However, they differ from Keynes regarding the belief of a need for a deeper break with neoclassical microeconomics, but they are divided amongst themselves regarding what pieces of neoclassical microeconomics should be kept and what pieces should be discarded. Let's now turn to the other side of this story, the German historical school. This is the second dimension of the post-Keynesian project, which is the recovery of the ideas of the German historical school and then fusing those ideas with an appropriate post-Keynesian version of Keynesianism. And so figure 3 provides my schematic outline of the German historical school. Again, once again, I want to emphasize it has a certain shock value, knocking away, this is what you traditionally learn in undergraduate and graduate school. This is what you don't learn. This is the invisible part of economic thought. It sort of goes to show how the Anglo-Saxon school monopolizes modern economics and has excluded vast swathes of economic thought. Now, the issues raised in the Methodenstreit are still critical, and they're very present in post-Keynesian economics. Those issues are substantially ignored by the mainstream, and of course, they're complicated issues, so they're the cause of division and dispute amongst post-Keynesians. That's why this is a lively community of thought, because there are these differences about how to grapple with these difficult subjects. And just as there are differences about what pieces of neoclassical microeconomics to retain, so too there are differences about what pieces of German historical thought should be included in post-Keynesian economics and how they should be included. And what you will find is that these divisions are often methodological. You'll find methodology is important in post-Keynesian economics. It's because the issues raised by the German historical school are methodological, and therefore that's why post-Keynesians struggle over them. Now, the German school views the economy as characterized by institutions, practices, and cultural understandings that have accumulated over time. Economic principles are at work, but they are at work within a historically created context. And that's in sharp contrast to the Anglo-Saxon school, which adopts an ahistorical, mechanistic approach to the economy, and which modern neoclassical theory formulates in terms of axioms of behavior and assumptions about market functioning. So modern neoclassical economics asserts what we call a universalist theory, that applies to all countries in all circumstances. And that is a fundamental distinction from the German historical school, which emphasizes the role of history in shaping individual economies. Now, this difference over the economic role and significance of history can be understood through the concepts of hysteresis, path dependence, and cumulative causation that have all been emphasized by post-Keynesians. In a hysteretic system, history is a one-way train that cannot be rolled back. And that fits very clearly with the German school approach to understanding the economy. In contrast, the axiomatic AngloSaxon approach tends to ignore restrictions imposed by history. And so you see economic possibilities are analyzed with the method of comparative statics, in which change is easily reversible. A second big difference between the German school and the Anglo-Saxon school is the issue of equilibrium. I raise that now. I'm going to come back to it again. It's a very controversial issue, and I have a sort of a non-doctrinaire approach to it myself. But equilibrium, I flag it as a source of great disagreement amongst post-Keynesians. In fact, too much disagreement in my view. Now, figure 3 here identifies 3 different branches of the German school. There's Marxism, there's the Austrian and Schumpeterian schools, and there's the American institutionalist school. The Marxist branch, follow it down, is divided into 3 subgroups: Marxism, modern Marxism, and neoclassical Marxism. Classical Marxism views capitalism as a dynamic, productive form of economic organization that generates steady, systematic technological advance and systematically increases per capita output. Value for the classical Marxists derives from labor, and the goal of capitalism is the extraction of labor surplus from the productive process for purposes of capital accumulation. This extraction process is aided by the reserve army of unemployed that weakens the bargaining power of workers. Important point here. Classical Marxism is a non-equilibrium theory. The economy is punctuated by irregular crises that occur because capital accumulation increases the capital intensity of production, thereby lowering the profit rate and undermining the accumulation process. The crisis then triggers interventions that restore profitability and reset the process, which then continues until the next crisis. Modern Marxism is associated with the economics of Kalecki, Sweezy, Baran, and Steindl. It emphasizes the role of monopoly capital. It places corporations and market power at the center of the process of technological innovation and profit extraction. This power-based theory of income distribution is then placed in a Kaleckian aggregate demand framework in which the distribution of income between profits and wages affects aggregate demand. That in turn impacts output and employment in accordance with Keynesian logic. So you can already see how Kalecki is very, very compatible with the Keynesian approach to output determination. So modern Marxism begins the process of marrying Keynes and Marx. It abandons the labor theory of value, and it also abandons the classical Marxist falling rate of profit crisis dynamic. The third branch of Marxist theory is neoclassical Marxism that's associated with the American economists John Romer, Sam Bowles, and Herbert Gintis. This is very much a contemporary fringe mode of analysis, which is significantly methodologically focused. The aim of the modern Marxists is to use neoclassical economic principles, i.e. marginalism and marginal productivity theory, and they want to use also mainstream mathematical methods, i.e. optimization and equilibrium. And then they want to show that Marxist concerns can be fully incorporated into modern neoclassical microeconomics. So neoclassical Marxism is essentially concerned with microeconomics. It contributes nothing, in my view, to macroeconomics. And with regard to substance, its major focus is the issue of extraction of labor power and the notion of unequal exchange, formalizing the notion of unequal exchange. Now, the second branch of the German historical school is the Austrians and Schumpeterians. With regard to the Austrian school, there's need to distinguish between the 19th century Austrians and the 20th century Austrians. This is the point of confusion that people often trip on. 19th century Austrian economics I associate with someone like Karl Menger. And it contributed very much to the paradigm, to the development of the paradigm of methodological individualism, subjective value theory, and marginal utility theory. All of that, all the Mengerian line of thought on those issues has been incorporated into mainstream Anglo-Saxon marginalist economics. It's 20th century Austrian economics that is more interesting and more radical. It's associated with the work of von Mises and von Hayek, and it's obviously the source of European neoliberalism. The political claim of these Austrian neoliberals, Hayek and Mises, is that deregulated markets are the best protection of liberty. That's Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. The economic claim is that the pursuit of self-interest and profit maximization in a deregulated economy leads to best economic outcomes. Now, what's important here is this economic claim, it sounds quite similar to the first welfare theorem of general equilibrium theory. But the Austrians do not rationalize it in the same formal manner as the neoclassicals. The Austrians do not have a notion of competitive general equilibrium. And they don't have any notion of anything like Pareto optimality. In fact, the Austrians completely reject competitive general equilibrium theory because they reject the concepts of equilibrium and disequilibrium. The two kind of go together. If you believe in equilibrium, you're away from it, then you're in disequilibrium. If you reject equilibrium, then you reject disequilibrium as a way of thinking as well. Instead, Austrians view the economy as in constant flux, owing to learning from experience, owing to innovation, and owing to competition. In this world, equilibrium is simply impossible. Again, it's an ontological impossibility as far as Austrians are concerned. And of course, Schumpeterian economics is very closely related. Well, guess what? Schumpeter was an Austrian from Vienna. But its focus is more narrow. Schumpeterian economics is focused on competition and technological change. For Schumpeter, the competitive search for profit generates a process of creative destruction. New products, technologies, and firms are created. Existing products, technologies, and firms are destroyed. Note, this too is a non-equilibrium process. It's an ongoing process of persistent change. And then the third branch of the German historical school is the American institutionalists, and here I'm thinking of Richard Ely, etc. These were Europeans and Germans who came to America in the 19th century, bringing with them this line of thought. And I think John Commons comes closest to providing the most comprehensive theoretical statement. And it's one of the problems with the American institution. There is no sort of really comprehensive theoretical statement. For Commons, the transaction is the fundamental unit of economic analysis. Transactions. And the role of institutions, which of course includes law and policy, is to exert a collective influence to shape transactions so that they deliver socially desirable outcomes. That's the Commons approach to thinking about institutional economics. Now, Post-Keynesian economics has been strongly influenced by all of these ideas in the German school. And in particular, it's been influenced by the modern Marxists. Here I'm talking Kletzky, Steindl, Baran. by Schumpeterians, I'll explain in a little while, and by American institutionalists. The German school raises important methodological issues that were flagged by early post-Keynesians like Joan Robinson and Nicholas Kaldor. One issue we've already discussed is the role of history and hysteresis, and obviously Kaldor was a big contributor to that literature. A second issue is equilibrium. Whereas neoclassical economics embraces equilibrium, the German school rejects equilibrium. Classical Marxists view the economy's trajectory in terms of eventual crisis, a non-equilibrium process. Austrians and Schumpeterians represent the economy as being in continual flux, again, a non-equilibrium process. Keynes sought to straddle the issue with his construct of shifting equilibrium. I don't think it works, by the way, but I know that he was clearly concerned with this issue of equilibrium. And these differences have made equilibrium a significant point of contention within post-Keynesian economics, as well as a dividing marker from neoclassical economics. Okay, where are we at now? Okay, now we've got 20 minutes more. Yeah, I'm right on time. 20 minutes to wrap up. Part 3. So our excursion into the history of economic thought has raised a range of issues regarding theory and methodology that are all important for post-Keynesian economics. So now I want to try and close by bringing these pieces together and show how the history of thought has contributed to shaping post-Keynesian economics. And figure 4 here shows the varieties of Keynesianism that constitute the post-Keynesian landscape. It continues figure 1, showing how the ideas of the Anglo-Saxon school and the ideas of the German historical school have dropped down to shape modern post-Keynesian economics. Going to do this counterclockwise. We can see, reading counterclockwise, there are the Keynesian institutionalists, the Minskians, the Neo-Kaletskians, the regulationists and the SSA School, the fundamental Keynesians, the ISLM neo-Keynesians, the Kaldorians, and the Sraffians. When I say this, sometimes I feel like I'm on an episode of Star Trek, Kaldorians and Sraffians and so on. But now the central unifying element in this picture here is Keynes and his notion of aggregate effective demand determined output. That concept infuses every variety of post-Keynesianism, and Keynes's general theory is therefore the bedrock of post-Keynesian economics. Keynes brought Malthus back into the picture and began the process of walking away from neoclassical microeconomics and classical macroeconomics. Post-Keynesians have sought to continue this process of walking away from neoclassical microeconomics, but they have also sought to bring the ideas of the German historical school back into the picture. Let's start now working counterclockwise. The American institutionalist tradition is best represented in the work of John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith is what I would call a Keynesian institutionalist. Galbraith embraced Keynesian macroeconomics, particularly the role of fiscal policy in stabilizing the economy. The corporation is Galbraith's central theoretical construct. But in my view, it has yet to be adequately incorporated into macroeconomics. The neoclassical theory of the imperfectly competitive firm is a pale shadow of what Galbraith envisaged. You should go and read Galbraith's The New Industrial State, Affluent Society, book on bargaining power, The American Economy from 1952. They have a very different view of what the firm is, and imperfect competition doesn't get close to capturing the world that Galbraith is describing. Alfred Eichner pursued this research agenda with his construct of the megacorp, but it has not taken hold. How I see it is that whereas the social and political impact of the corporation is widely acknowledged, its impact on macroeconomics, including post-Keynesian economics, remains elusive. In my view, in many ways, we're all Galbraithians now, yet Galbraith's impact on formal economics and macroeconomics is very marginal. Next in line come the Minskians. Hyman Minsky and the Minskians represent the Schumpeterian tradition in post-Keynesian economics. That may come as a surprise to you, but Minsky was actually a student of Schumpeter's at Harvard. With regard to the Keynesian dimension, Minsky firmly embraced Keynes's theory of effective demand, particularly Keynes's emphasis on the role of investment and investment fluctuations, to which he added the importance of finance in affecting investment, and you all need to read Steve Fazari's papers on Minsky, which give the best, by far the best description of Minsky's theory of investment. The Schumpeterian dimension to Minsky's thought concerns the dynamic of the economy. Schumpeter applied the process of creative destruction to industry. Minsky applies the process of creative destruction to finance. When applied to industry, creative destruction produces growth, and there can be cycles and waves if innovations come in bunches. When applied to finance, creative destruction produces business cycles that end in crisis. And in a paper that I've written about Minsky, I like to distinguish between Minsky actually having two types of cycles in his work. The one cycle I call the basic cycle, which is a sort of standard 4 to 8 year boom-bust cycle that is driven by improving borrower and lender psychological sentiments. The second cycle is the super cycle, which goes over maybe several decades even. And it has borrowers and lenders and financial regulators and policymakers all gradually becoming conceited and forgetful of past crises. As a result, they change the rules of the game and they change the rules of risk assessment over several business cycles, over the course of several basic cycles, in other words. That allows more and more risk into the system, eventually producing a crisis like we saw in 1929 and like we saw again in 2008. Now, both types of cycles are driven by the dynamic of stability breeding instability. The good times cause behavior to become more risky. However, it is the super cycle that is Schumpeterian. Why is that? It's because agents who refuse to accept the new financial products and the new financial practices are swept away by the temporary profits of those who do. If you were on Wall Street in 2002 and 2003 and you were not selling subprime, you were a fool. You were going to lose your job. But it was the right thing to do not to sell it. But you couldn't stand in front of that temporary tidal wave of profits. And that's how Minsky is a crisis theorist, and he's Schumpeterian, but he locates the engine of crisis in the financial sector. Now we come to the Neo-Kaletskians, a very important, perhaps the major school. This conference you'll hear lots and lots of Neo-Kaletskian thinking. It's probably the dominant benchmark mode into which we try and fit other pieces of post-Keynesian thinking. Obviously it builds on the work of Mikhail Kalecki, and Kalecki's great contribution is to make income distribution central to Keynesian economics. And as a result, Kalecki's ideas are now a central component of post-Keynesian economics. The general theory is rather quiet on income distribution, reflecting, I think, Keynes's conservative political inclinations. Keynes was a liberal, in the old-fashioned way of the word, 19th century. Keynes, and I suppose he'd be a 20th century liberal too, yeah, probably more so. Kalecki revived concern with income distribution, focusing on the functional income distribution, the split between wages and profits. His argument was that the propensity to spend out of wages exceeds the propensity to spend out of profits, so that an increase in the wage share tends to raise aggregate demand and economic activity, and vice versa, an increase in the profit share lowers aggregate demand and economic activity. Neo-Kaleckians refine Kalecki's insights by recognizing the potential conflicting effects of changes in the functional distribution of income. A higher wage share raises consumption, but it can therefore reduce investment, and there's therefore a potential conflict to be sorted out. And of course, in Neo-Kaleckian growth models, that conflict gives rise to three possible regimes: wage-led economies, profit-led economies, and conflictive economies. The regulationist, next comes the French regulationist and American social structure of accumulation school, SSA, social structure of accumulation. The regulationist school combines Kaleckian macroeconomics with institutionalism. It's very specific about the need to put more institutions in. It's a sort of a matter of emphasis, one might say, compared to the neo-Kaleckians. It is therefore a mix of modern Marxism, American institutionalism, and Keynesianism. The SSA School is associated with the American New Left of the 1960s. It was initially inspired by classical Marxism, and it rejected Keynesianism, including Galbraith's Keynesian institutionalism. However, I would say over the past 30 years, the SSA School has increasingly merged back into the post-Keynesian fold by adopting the Kaleckian model. But there's one regard in which the SSA School remains distinctive and connected to its early classical Marxist roots, and that is because it still emphasizes over-accumulation of capital as the cause of crises. Next comes fundamental Keynesianism, and here I think of Shackle and Paul Davidson, and it represents a very early branch of descent to neo-Keynesianism. And there are two ingredients to fundamental Keynesianism. One is money, and the other is fundamental uncertainty. Money is a sink for purchasing power. Agents can choose to delay spending and hold money, thereby draining aggregate demand from the circular flow of income linking firms and households. And to this, Keynes, in the general theory, emphasized that money had near zero elasticity of production and near zero elasticity of substitution. What does he mean by that? He means that it's impossible for an unemployed worker to produce money. That's the near zero elasticity of production. And as regards to the near zero elasticity of substitution, that means an increase in money demand does not increase its price and divert demand to other produced goods. These are axioms regarding general equilibrium theory that don't carry over to a monetary economy. So money is critical to the fundamental Keynesians. And that then gets us back to this other critical ingredient, fundamental uncertainty. It is because of fundamental uncertainty that we have a rationale for the existence of money. So aggregate demand, money, and fundamental uncertainty are connected through that line of reasoning. Next comes ISLM neo-Keynesianism. This is a perspective which dominated mainstream economics from 1945 to 1970, the Keynesian golden age. Now, I have to say that many post-Keynesians seem to regard Hicks's ISLM model as the devil. Gone. I disagree with that. I think it's actually a brilliant and powerful analytical framework. Now, what is ISLM? ISLM is essentially, it can be understood as two-dimensional macroeconomic equilibrium analysis conducted in real output interest rate space. Now, this is the important point. Like any model, ISLM can be incompletely or incorrectly specified. But it's very important, it's absolutely critical to distinguish between specification and architecture. I think the architecture is brilliant, but I think that Hicks's specification was flawed, though I have to say it's flawed because the general theory is flawed. It's unfair to blame Hicks totally. There are flaws in the general theory. The neo-Keynesian specification of the ISLM was severely flawed, but the architecture is enduring. Unfortunately, post-Keynesians have conflated specification flaws with architectural flaws and have mistakenly discarded the architecture. That's a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So one clear area of misspecification is the neo-Keynesian ISLM description of the money supply. And that's one reason why post-Keynesians have spent so much time on the theory of endogenous money. It's a problem in the ISLM model, and of course, since money is so important for macroeconomics, there's a reason we need to understand the money supply if you're going to get macroeconomics right. A second irreconcilable specification between post-Keynesians and neo-Keynesians concerns the impact of lower nominal wages and prices on aggregate demand. Keynes clearly believed price and nominal wage adjustment might not be able to ensure full employment. Neo-Keynesians argued they could via the Keynes real balance money supply effect and via the Pigou wealth effect. Neo-Keynesians therefore concluded Keynes's demand-deficient unemployment would only prevail if prices and nominal wages are downwardly rigid, and that made Keynes's general theory a special case based on downward nominal rigidities. Post-Keynesians reject that view based on the Fisher debt effect and on the Tobin-Mundell deflation effect, so that whereby lower nominal wages and deflation both lower aggregate demand. But those features can be incorporated into the ISLM model. The stability properties start to become problematic, and that in a sense is the essence of Keynes. The market is not going to cure unemployment. It may actually push you away from full employment, but the architecture for analyzing what's going on in the model remains intact. Almost at our end. We've got two little Kaldorians and Sraffians. We're going to make this in an hour. This is amazing. Kaldorians emphasize the ideas of Nicholas Kaldor, and these ideas constitute an important but eclectic set of ideas, rather than being a Keynesian perspective on capitalism. All of these groups that I've been talking about are very big picture thinkers. They're thinking about what does capitalism look like. Kaldor is a set of, I think of Kaldorians as having a set of ideas rather than a vision of capitalism. A first idea, Kaldor was a seminal contributor to the theory of endogenous money. Post-Keynesian endogenous money theory begins with Kaldor in a way. Well, you can trace it back in the history of thought further if you wish, but the modern engagement with the issue begins with Kaldor. Second, Kaldor was a seminal contributor to endogenous growth theory and cumulative causation theory, those German school ideas. Third, Kaldor was also a critic of equilibrium and emphasized the role of history via this process of cumulative causation. Fourth, Kaldor's work on the business cycle pioneered nonlinear macroeconomics, which can generate multiple equilibria, limit cycles, or chaotic dynamics. Fourth, Kaldor's Keynesian theory of income distribution maintained that in the long run, distribution would adjust to bring aggregate demand into alignment with normal capacity utilization. So he abandoned marginal productivity theory for his sort of own pseudo-Kaleckian theory of income distribution. But that raises one important issue of contention. Kaldor assumed in the long run the economy would operate at normal capacity utilization, whereas Kaleckians and neo-Kaleckians believe that long-run capacity utilization is variable and affected by macroeconomic conditions. And that I point to now as an unresolved point of contention within post-Keynesian economics. Sraffians, our final stop on this 7-capital tour. Sraffians are associated with the work of Piero Sraffa at Cambridge in his book, The Production of Commodities, by the use of production of commodities and the use of by means of commodities, 1960. It's something. The Sraffians are something of an oddity in this post-Keynesian collection of thinkers. That is because their focus is the supply side of the economy and its implications. However, they are Keynesian because they fully accept Keynes's principle of effective demand-determined output. So the Sraffians were at the center of the Cambridge capital controversies of the 1950s and 1960s, which launched a critique of neoclassical marginal productivity theory of capital. And the Sraffian critique originates in Ricardo. That's why the connection all the way back to David Ricardo, 1810, to the Sraffians in the 1960s. Ricardo's conundrum is about the impossibility of establishing value without a theory of distribution. If production uses capital, one cannot establish the price of capital without knowing the return embodied in the capital being used. There's a circularity to it. And this is the problem that Ricardo could never sort out, and this is the problem that Safar tried to sort out. So consequently, if this is correct, it's impossible for capital to establish its own rate of return, which is what marginal productivity of capital theory says goes on. Because one doesn't know how much capital one has without first having the price of capital. So Safarian theory is clearly a deep-seated critique of neoclassical macroeconomics, but its additional implications for macroeconomics are unclear, and that's why I put it to the side. If we had more time, I would try and continue this and show how we might build my own view of what a unified post-Keynesian economics would look like, but I hope that this at least has helped you get a picture of how these ideas, often presented as a taxonomy of ideas, actually fall out of the history of thought. There's an organicness to the development of what's going on, and I hope it also makes clear why there are disputes. Yes, we are a fractious group on personality alone, but we also have reason to be fractious intellectually because there are deep issues, and how to merge them and whether a merging is possible is an open question. I believe some sort of merging is possible, but the ideas are not all 100% compatible. You may have to take pieces of Marx and merge it with Keynes and Safar and discard other pieces. And that's the sort of where the disputes get traction in the room. Thanks very much.